We got a nice surprise today through some of the Cleveland radio stations. Coach Kevin Stefanski sitting down first with Ken Carmen and Anthony Lima, doing some work over at ESPN. And I gotta be honest, the local radio affiliates handled these interviews extremely well. And they always make Coach Stefanski come off in a more fun light. We're going to talk about that, some other things. Browns 3D on the OBR starts now. Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends, your daily delivery of all things Dog Pound Browns 3D on the OBR streaming network. We appreciate all of you for the support here for the OBR as a whole, whether it's coming out and reading the written content from our fantastic writers every single day, or joining us on the OBR streaming network nightly starting at 6 p.m. with Browns 3D, hosted by myself, Jeff Lloyd, various shows on the streaming network throughout the week as well. Make sure you're subscribed to the OBR on YouTube, and make sure, of course, that you subscribe to the OBR on Twitch. So the morning got started with Coach Stefanski on The Fan, again, with Ken Carmen and Anthony Lima. I feel the guys today a really good job because it just comes off like a conversation. It doesn't necessarily come off like an interview. And, I think for as buttoned up as everybody tries to make Kevin Stefanski out to be, that's not necessarily truly who he is. It's kind of the way it comes off, of course, within, media circles and obviously the questions that get asked, and then you're not going to answer them. So which makes for the awkwardness, certainly, or some of these, um, pressers that they do, or certainly, some of the back and forth with certain media members. They certainly got Coach Steph, not necessarily to basically give up his hold card, which he is not going to do. But they got Coach Stefanski to talk about, the quarterback situation, and several aspects of it. Kenny Pickett, and with Kenny Pickett, basically from what you heard from Coach Stefanski's words today. Now you got to keep in mind the draft that Kenny Pickett was in was also the same offseason where the Browns ended up acquiring Deshaun Watson. So as we all know, at the time, the Browns, had basically not physically moved Baker Mayfield off the roster yet, but for all intents and purposes, had moved on from Baker Mayfield at that point. Kenny Pickett was the only first round quarterback in that class. So the Browns certainly had done their research on Kenny Pickett. Coach Stefanski mentioned that, football friend wise, Coach Narduzzi from Pittsburgh, the head coach there, was an acquaintance and a confidant, and they certainly had done their work on Kenny Pickett. They actually thought Kenny Pickett was a pretty solid prospect. We're not going to get to know whether or not, they had intentions of drafting Kenny Pickett, of course, because then it meant ultimately, the trade went down to acquire Deshaun Watson and then took away the first round pick that the Browns, could have possibly used it if they wanted to on Kenny Pickett. He spoke about his short time in Pittsburgh. He spoke about his time in Philadelphia this one past season. As we know, of course, the Browns and the Eagles have always had a pretty good relationship. Andrew Berry, having worked for both organizations, certainly other people that have been part of the Cleveland Browns also were part of the Philadelphia Eagles as well. So two franchises that kind of, value some things similarly, tried to emulate each other more, the Browns emulating the Eagles and maybe the Eagles emulating the Browns, of course. But, for my takeaway from the way he spoke about Kenny Pickett is, I'm not saying anybody's got a job here to lose, but I did feel that, it seemed like, coach really, wanted to give, a strong opportunity, a fair opportunity, certainly to Kenny Pickett. So with that, then he got to speaking about Shedeur Sanders and, of course, Shedeur's father, Deion Sanders. And they approached, what people, are trying to portray the situation of having Shedeur on the roster is going to be. and Dion, maybe having a bat line into the facility. And coach, kind of, quietly dismissed that and, spoke that, there is a relationship with Dion Sanders. It's, a small one. Did mention that a lot of Colorado staff had been in Cleveland recently. They basically were kind of, basically a workshop, if you will, where the Colorado staff and the Brown staff were getting together, kind of trading notes, talking, passing things back and forth. But Coach Stefanski did, of course, make an emphasis on the fact that, it's not like, Dion is, basically trying to pull, the puppet strings for Shedeur from, 2,000 miles away in Boulder, Colorado. He praised Coach Sanders for his work with the Colorado Buffaloes. Um, but most importantly, made it sound and pretty significantly made it sound that, Shedeur Sanders is a Cleveland Brown now, and the Browns will handle Shedeur Sanders how, they see fit. The name and OBR insiders, you guys should have known, right? I mean, this was brought up way, I would say, maybe a week or two into the offseason. Um, and because, it had been mentioned and linked to Pittsburgh, and now it seems like, the Browns were being mentioned. If you have the OBR insider package, you'd probably already heard this or read this, but the Browns may be having some interest in Chris Olave from the New Orleans Saints. If anybody remembers my work, I thought Chris Olave was probably just as good as Garrett Wilson was a few years ago when both guys were coming out. Um, I really, really just liked Olave's body control. I really just felt that he was impressive. Yards after the catch were certainly impressive. Um, at the time I had said I don't know what the big difference necessarily is between Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. People tried to bring up athleticism and running speed, and then the combine came, and Chris Olave, basically backed up everything I felt that, he was not just a good football player, he was also a very good athlete as well. Whether or not Chris Olave is essentially on the market, I don't think anybody truly knows the answer to that at this point. But there is some, you know, ways to look at this, certainly. Chris Olave now going into the fourth year. I think at times he's had certainly, some great moments with the Saints. Certainly has been a little bit difficult for Chris Olave in his time with New Orleans. The basically up and down quarterback play of Derek Carr, which now that they will move on from. You look at the way that quarterback room is currently set up for 2025, and a guy like Chris Olave, who's, in this part of his career where certainly you would be, looking towards, possible contract extension. I'm not sure maybe the Saints are ready to commit to that with where they are organizationally. Um, the other thing to factor into this is, of course, what would be the cost. Now, Olave, unfortunately, has had, some concussion issues in his time in New Orleans. Now we know the Browns, and we have seen this through, recent wide receiver moves. They are trying to get what they feel as far as trading for a wide receiver. They're trying to get a guy, that they still feel has a ton of talent, but hopefully maybe getting him, for a less than maybe market fair price. See Amari Cooper, certainly. See Jerry Jeudy as well. Now, I'm not sure that that is something where, the Saints, would move on from Olave without getting something significant in return. The question is, what exactly would be deemed significant? I think if you said Chris Olave is probably available for a third round pick, I think you have more than half the league probably interested. Now, that question, of course, then could be dummied down to is, would you go possibly to a second round pick to acquire a guy like Chris Olave? Well, that could work, and the reason it certainly could work for Cleveland, in my opinion, is we've talked about this before. The Cleveland Browns hold 2 first-round picks in the 2026 first-round draft. So if I am going to have to give up a second-round pick to acquire a guy like Chris Olave, and I've already told you all, if I have those 2 first-round picks in 2026 in the first round, the belief, of course, for right now, until we actually get to see Shedeur Sanders and Dylan Gabriel, Dillon Gabriel, wink, wink, play, the belief would be you're going to use that top first round pick on a quarterback. Again, Sanders and Gabriel have the opportunity to change this thought process. But while we're sitting here 11 months out, for me, this is probably, what would be the determination at this point of how to handle that. So I take whatever I feel is, my favorite quarterback in the class with that top first round pick, with the upper first round pick. And then I can just easily trade down from the second first round pick and acquire whatever assets I possibly gave up to bring in Chris Olave. So it's something that I can make happen now, and I can readjust for the lost capital down the road. Whether or not, again, this is legit that Olave is truly on the market because, some way, our guys here and obviously heard early in the offseason, hey, the Browns may have some interest in Chris Olave. We don't necessarily have anything on the back end of this New Orleans Saints related that's basically confirming that the Saints would move on from Chris Olave. Now, if they don't have any intention of working a contract, and they don't have to do it now or even this summer, it certainly could be done, something that would be done maybe during the year in 2025 or the offseason from 2025 to 2026. So we don't know either way whether or not, the Saints are pursuing this or even interested in this. We know the Browns like their Buckeyes, obviously, certainly always, kind of peeking in there, of course, and have a lot of interest as the Browns possess a high number of former Ohio State Buckeyes on this roster. So if you tell me that there is a chance to go out and bring in a guy like Chris Olave, I'm crazy interested. Again, I was a huge fan when he was coming out of Ohio State. Certainly, Browns were not going to have the opportunity to draft him as he went. I think it was 10, I want to say, in his draft class in a first round where the Browns did not possess a first round pick, of course. But, to make a move to bring in a player like that, who's got the juice like that, and, hey, if Tillman hits, it makes for a great wide receiver room for Cleveland between Judy, Olave, and Tillman. If Tillman cannot hit that level of that 3-game stretch that he had this past fall in 2024, which may not be the case. You'd love to see Cedric hit, but maybe he just turns out to be a rotational wide receiver. Then you would not have yourself a number 1 in Judy, a number 2 in Chris Olave. And this could be also something where the Browns can kind of offset the cost of possibly giving Chris Olave a contract extension due to the fact that right now they have 2 rookie quarterbacks on the roster and possibly would have a third rookie contract from the quarterback position on the roster come April of 2026. But again, if Chris Olave is there to be had, I am absolutely interested in a player with the talent and skill level of Chris Olave. Now, I thought a lot during the offseason about the Cleveland Browns, and my thought process was certainly about trying to upgrade the pass rush. And certainly the Browns went another direction, not saying that Mason Graham will not be a contributor as far as, pass rush opportunities and helping with the pass rush, of course. But the Cleveland Browns, saw that they were a team that gave up over 108 yards rushing 12 out of 17 games in 2024. To say that they were gashed at multiple times would certainly be an understatement. Now, of course, you know, the players being in and out of the defensive tackle room, Mike Hall missing a lot of time, with his, off-field issue that he had last year, and others certainly, missing Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah for the amount of time that the Cleveland Browns did as well. That certainly was not an easy situation for them to handle as far as being able to stop the opponent's running game. But you kind of look at, the first two picks and what the Browns ultimately ended up doing by bringing in a top-notch defensive tackle, by bringing in a guy that the Browns think is going to be a great linebacker in Carson Schlesinger, for ultimately just this year for Carson Schlesinger to basically step into maybe the lead role at the linebacker position and certainly be someone that is going to be an answer to, the questions of being unable to stop the run that the 2024 defense did have, of course. Now, looking at that, I still kind of have my questions about, where is, hopefully the pass rush assistance that Myles Garrett doesn't need, because we know what Myles gives us, but who else can kind of, be a part to get that sack total number, you know, a little bit more close to league average, if not even higher than league average. We've talked about Isaiah McGuire a ton, and Isaiah certainly is, becoming a very competent player, a player who grades out extremely well, a guy that, shows great detail to performing his assignment on the field. Now, the question certainly is going to be, between him, between Alex Wright, between Joe Tryon-Shoyinka, what can these guys bring as far as a sack total in getting this defensive line back closer to a sack number that probably reflects what a Jim Schwartz defense normally gives you, what it normally kind of looks like. Now, with McGuire, and I said on here, I guess it was a few episodes back, probably you're hoping maybe somewhere that 5 to 8 number, can McGuire get you to that point? And if you look at, the improvement, you look at where McGuire was originally drafted, certainly got opportunities as a rookie to play, and certainly, showed some development there. Got a lot more playing time last year with the injury to Alex Wright, and then the ultimate moving on in the trade of Zadarius Smith to Detroit, which, put McGuire essentially in a starting position to close out the season. Not, you know, not a wow athlete, McGuire, but certainly a smart technical guy, has good technique. So for McGuire, a lot of this is hopefully going to be, just more experience paying off for him, still being disciplined in his pass rush lane, because how many times do we see Myles Garrett coming so fast that Myles is not necessarily the one, that's getting all the sacks, but Myles sometimes is running quarterbacks into the pass rush lane for someone else on the Browns to basically get the sack. Now, Wright is another one here, and the Browns have a lot of players, who are on contract years. Alex Wright, whether it's been, times on the inside or times on the outside, Alex has always been an interesting guy. I don't think, for some of us who were big Alex Wright fans when he was coming out of UAB, we kind of really thought it was all just gonna come together, and eventually he was going to be that guy. Again, did not necessarily happen to this point. But again, you're talking about another player, technically sound, can contribute in more than one spot on that defensive line. Um, kind of what he was doing when he was at UAB, just UAB's best all around defensive lineman. And they took advantage of it by, putting him on the inside, certainly putting him on the outside, wherever they felt the weaknesses are. So, for Alex Wright, this is, a big year. Certainly it is his contract year. And, Alex Wright, certainly would be like to be a guy that probably clears that 5 sack threshold, which puts him in a position to, recoup, to bag a nice bag this offseason. Joe Tryon Shoyinka, it's going to be interesting how he works within the Jim Schwartz system. Coming out of Washington, he would have been a guy that probably would have been somebody that maybe would have fit a Schwartz scheme. But his time in Tampa, most of it was spent, in an odd front 3-4 with, Joe standing, most of the time standing straight up, not with a hand in the ground. His tape at Washington, he was a, hand in the ground type player. So this is one that could really turn out to be interesting for Cleveland, the way it works out. It could be like one of those moves that we're all looking here at the end of September, early October, and saying, man, for what you got him for, what you paid him for, you got a pretty nice return on your investment. So Joe certainly is a guy that, going to monitor, and it's going to see certainly how the snap count works for Cleveland at, the DN position opposite Myles Garrett, between McGuire, certainly between Wright, and certainly between, Tryon Shanka. Is Agbo Okoronkwo a guy that is going to be here? He's sitting there at a veteran, maybe the fifth in line of all these defensive ends. It does give you some pause and hesitation whether or not Agbo will be here. You kind of know what Agbo can give you if he will be here. Now you kind of look at, on the interior, and certainly a lot of this, in my opinion, comes down to the health of Mike Hall. Is Mike, by the time the regular season rolls around, is Mike still rehabbing his way into, you know, his ultimate football shape, or is he already in his ultimate football shape by the time the regular season starts? And he's probably one of the bigger keys for the Cleveland Browns overall, as far as the defense and the team is concerned in 2025. When the Browns drafted him a little bit more than a year ago, they absolutely had all the, praise in the world for what Mike could do. Even though there was a lot of missed time at Ohio State, when he did play, the production was there. The athleticism backed all of that up when all the testing came down for Mike Hall, and was really starting to pick it up before suffering that season-ending injury in Baltimore in the last week of the 2024 regular season. And, I was a guy, and, we talked about it with Pete Smith several times. And obviously, if anybody would be able to know the true, type of player on the inside that Mike Hall is, somebody that spent, 3 years with him at Streetsboro High School, would be Pete Smith, of course. And, there were times where I mentioned to Pete, do we think he could also get some reps on the outside? And, Pete was full on in agreement that, yes, there's no reason that Mike Hall couldn't also contribute at the edge position and nickel positions and then dime positions. Certainly, certainly a player that can do that for this franchise. So, Mike Hall, again, one of the bigger players that you are looking for, as far as what can be done here in year two. A lot of it, I think, is just going to come down to where he is at in coming back, certainly from what the injury was that ended, his 2024 season just a little bit early, obviously, because it was week 18. But he is a huge, huge factor to this team as well. When you're talking about the defense overall, I think he's still just going to go back to the safety position. I don't think anybody really has any doubts or concerns with what Grant Telpett gives this team. And Grant is certainly a guy that is a big, big contributor, certainly, playing in the box, covering tight ends, working, within run fits to take care of the running game and slow down the running game. I don't think you want to get into a position where, you're having Grant Delpit have to pay more attention playing a cover 2 safety position, a cover 3 safety position, where he's further off the ball. Grant's a guy that's got a lot of juice to him. Playing him within the box, closer to the box, certainly goes more to his skill set, certainly, gives a better, overall production from this defense, if that is the usage you can use Grant Delpit in. Look, he can play deep cover, and we saw that, I guess it was a couple of years ago in week one, where it was all over T. Higgins 35 yards down the field. But again, it's not necessarily the best usage or the best spot or the best role that a guy like Grant Delpit can give you. So certainly something that you have to keep your eyes on is that. And that'll come down to, former Ohio State Buckeye, Ronnie Hickman, of course. Now, Hickman, again, former UDFA, now in his third year. The opportunity is there for him to take the free safety role for his own. Or, does Hickman disappoint? And now the Browns are going to use some of the veterans, Jenkins, the two veterans they brought in more in that capacity. But for a guy like Ronnie Hickman, this is a huge opportunity. You don't, necessarily get to fall in line to getting a position like this, or even a starting position with a defense like this. So with that, you certainly have to, think more, look more into the way this all plays out, of course, for the Browns, certainly on the back end of the defense. And one of the best things that can aid the back end of the defense for the Cleveland Browns would certainly be the defensive line, the pass rush, getting back more onto the level that they performed and produced in 2023. Again, we'll start to get, more of, the strength for us to answer these questions next week when we actually get into mandatory OTAs. Some teams are already in there. The Browns obviously are not there yet. They will begin, I believe it is Wednesday. Again, Coach Stefanski speaking today. A lot of this was done, of course, so he can push some of the charity events. His wife and children have set up a charity, and Coach, certainly, going to the media, speaking about the team, trying to draw interest, help raise money for what his wife and kids are trying to do for other children within the Ohio, the Northeast Ohio area. And, obviously your big kudos, to Coach's wife and certainly the family for, trying to give back to the community in that respect. I do want to, reach out here. I know it is, basically high school graduation time, in Ohio. This year certainly hits a little bit more for me, as I will have a graduating senior where I'm at. We graduate a little later. It will be in June, of course. Um, but to all the listeners out there, whether, you are a younger kid yourself who is about to graduate, or you are a parent like me who's about to have, a child, go into this biggest transition of their life, from high school to either college or joining the workforce. Hey, number one, I'm with you guys all. I have the same type of, sadness in my heart, um, watching, a huge, huge chapter end and another huge chapter begin. But look, congrats to us all. We all busted our butts to try to be the best parents we can be, and hopefully, we put out some children into this world, who could hopefully, be people who, are difference makers without a question. Um, we will see you all after the weekend, and of course, Memorial Day weekend. The weather may not give off the Memorial Day weekend vibe right now. It's getting nicer where I'm at. Certainly not the weather, that normally lines up, certainly with Memorial Day weekend. But, take this opportunity, certainly to enjoy it, with your family, with your friends, fire up the grills, have some drinks, tell some stories, enjoy each other's company. Um, and again, eat well. What's the old line, Dave Matthews, eat well, drink, be merry, all that good stuff. We will continue to be here for you, week in, week out, giving you, our latest takes on everything happening, relative to your Cleveland Browns. I'm working on some things for next week, and it looks like we'll have some couple of great guests, joining us here next week. Twitter's DMs certainly have not helped. One of those episodes would have been today, but thanks, Elon. Appreciate you. Um, so with all that, again, we just want to thank you all, who come out every day, to the OBR. The support that you all give us here, it means a ton, of course, whether it's reading the written content, whether it's joining every night at 6 o'clock for the OBR streaming network, beginning with Browns 3D, hosted by myself. Many other shows come on, the network throughout the week as well. Do not listen to anything in regards to trading Deshaun Watson. Just as everyone here at the OBR told you the Browns cannot afford to trade Myles Garrett, we will tell you that the Browns cannot afford to trade Deshaun Watson. Cannot happen, will not happen. Read Jack Duffin's article, and you will get a list longer than your arm telling you why the Cleveland Browns cannot trade Deshaun Watson. Again, Browns 3D on the OBR streaming network. This has been your daily delivery of all things Dog Pound. Browns 3D on the OBR. Enjoy your Memorial Day weekend, and we will talk to you all next week.